So we've been seeing with increasing frequency people asking about having a hard time getting service, having a hard time selling their devices, so they bought directly from the manufacturers. What do you think about that?
Well, this has been a barrier that's been happening for almost a decade now, where manufacturers have, aesthetic device manufacturers, started out small and then got much broader, where they create these kind of artificial barriers, financial barriers, to keep customers from being able to service their devices, sell their devices, other than with the manufacturers themselves. And it all started many years ago with a manufacturer that was starting to control or wanted to control the service market. And so they created these recertification fees that a customer would have to pay in order for them to get their device re-registered if they wanted to use a third-party service provider. And these fees were relatively small at first, in the several thousands of dollars. Now they've creeped up to as high as $50,000. So I often talk about this concept of using Tesla as an example. And if you bought a Tesla for $100,000 and new, and then you decided to sell it, can you imagine if the buyer of that had to pay Elon $50,000 to be able to get windshield wipers or to get tires? No one would buy a Tesla. And there would be no secondary market for Teslas that would then affect the new market. And that's what's happening in laser devices or aesthetic devices or energy-based devices and aesthetics. These artificial, kind of illegal, unethical, and unjust practices of creating these artificial barriers make it so physicians and clinicians cannot sell their devices and service their devices in the secondary market, which ultimately pushes the device value down substantially, 50%, 75%, and ultimately who pays that is the original purchaser.
Okay, so then what can you do for third-party service to change some of those things to cover that market that's not being serviced because of those recertification fees?
Well, anytime in capital markets globally, you restrict capital exchange or free markets, you see alternative markets popping up. And that's what's happened in energy-based devices, is that there's a whole service market, third-party service market that's evolving to support sales of devices into the secondary market, so physicians, clinicians can recover some of the equity or not pay so much for service. And it's been a difficult process because the manufacturers control the manuals, they control the parts. And as this market's evolved, the manufacturers have developed more restrictive policies with their OEM partners, with their suppliers, with their service techs, with lockout codes, controlling manuals, all kinds of things, again, to try to restrict that market. But ultimately, we see in all free markets that the free market survives and recovers and also fights back. And we'll see, and we're starting to see now, some change with manufacturer behavior because they're seeing that physicians and clinicians are finding new and unique and alternative ways to service their devices safely, effectively, and at less cost.
So why do you think it's taken this long to get there, where that third-party market is really fighting back? The industry's been around for a while.
Well, the industry's relatively young. The energy device industry is coming up on 25 years. So it's not an old industry as you would think about automotives or building supplies or any other market. This is a relatively young space, and it's been somewhat like the Wild West. And so there really hasn't been any kind of collective connectivity in the marketplace with customers. They've been somewhat isolated, and the manufacturers prey on that isolation and push pretty hard on them individually. But now with social media and social connectivity, clinicians and physicians are coming together and sharing their experiences and beginning to fight back and open up networks where they can talk about these policies and behaviors and start to support the secondary and third-party marketplaces that are opening up.
Okay, so then what are some of the options to get parts outside of the manufacturers for third-party service providers?
Well, this is something that most clinicians and physicians don't understand is the manufacturers make some of the components, but the majority of the components are made by OEMs or OOEMs. So a manufacturer is considered an OEM, which is an original equipment manufacturer. But the components inside the device are made by an OEM, so the original equipment manufacturer. So they're made by, if a power supply is made for a laser, it's often made by a company that makes power supplies for all types of devices. It could be an industry, general industry, or machinery, or lumber. And the same thing's true with water pumps and displays and fiber delivery systems. These are made by OEMs. So part sourcing has become relatively easy as social media and connectivity and the worldwide market expands. We can find these parts much easier. Also, we're starting to see change because of margin erosion and sale erosion to the manufacturers, that we're seeing manufacturers change their behavior and begin to be more receptive to the open market. And as it's eroded their market share and decreased their revenue, they're starting to look at how they embrace the third-party market.
So this seems like it would tie in a little bit to, I've heard you say quite a few times, light is light. What do you mean by that in relation to parts?
Well, this is another thing that manufacturers have a tendency to, will describe their devices as being somewhat unique. Mm-hmm. And as we've talked about and in other interviews I've had, or podcasts, or online media, I've shown people that the lamps inside of these devices are all the same. Fundamentally, they're all made by a handful of manufacturers that make halogen and xenon bulbs. And I'm specifically talking about IPLs, intense pulse lights. So where Cyton would call a device a BBL, a broadband light, Palomar will call it an intense pulse light. It's really fundamentally the same. The lights are the bulbs are the same on the inside, and the filtration is the same. So when I talk about light is light, 560 wavelength light is 560 wavelength light, independent of which manufacturer it is. Now they do different things with pulse rate and peak power and a number of other factors, but ultimately light is light. And this, how this affects the parts is we can buy those parts, as can other third-party suppliers and service providers, and support clinicians' devices in a much more effective and less costly way. And this is why we're starting to see manufacturers change their behaviors, because they're seeing this erosion in their market share going away to third-party service providers that have access to these lamps.
So you talk about manufacturers changing their behaviors. Is it changing in a positive way? Or some examples of that?
No question. I think it's changing in a big way. And it's happening actually faster than I thought. I thought it would take a decade or more for manufacturers to start to see that their margins are eroding. And on one hand, we are seeing manufacturers continue to dig in and increase their predatory behavior. And I think they're starting to see that their top line sales, staff turnover, brand reputation is being harmed. And where there are manufacturers such as Cynosure that's kind of leading this change and opening up their markets to opening up their parts and service support to third-party markets globally, and understanding that this change is going to happen, and being a part of that kind of revolution to bring costs down and access to parts and information to keep patients safer, efficacy to patients high, and make it more profitable for clinicians to be offered more services. And so there are some big changes happening. And I think once some of these big manufacturers start to continue to follow Cynosure's path, we'll see it open up all over.
That's great. What are some ways that doctors can kind of take that power in their own hands and really help accelerate this process?
Great question. First thing is slow down. And clinicians have a tendency to purchase emotionally, not financially. And they're commonly pressured, and the sales reps are trained to provide that pressure at a very high level, and forcing the physician or clinician to make an emotional purchase, not a financial purchase. So the most important thing is slow down. And as I've often tell clinicians, there's no capital equipment emergencies, and especially in hair removal. No one is ever going to end up in the ER from not getting hair removal. So there's no urgency in which to buy that. Anything that you may lose in market share by not having that device, if you buy the wrong device, you're going to end up costing your bottom line, your EBIT, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, depending on the number of devices, because you bought emotionally. So slow down is by far the most important thing. And then understanding that light is light, that most of these devices do fundamentally the same thing. And we can spend a lot of time talking about how to protect themselves, but the most important thing is to go slow.
That's really great advice. Let's get into some of the questions that doctors, clinicians have sent in to us. I have about 3 or 4 set aside here. Wayne from Texas wanted to know how manufacturers can charge the prices they do the original purchase of their device. To specify, he purchased a laser direct from the manufacturer 4 years ago. About a month ago, his plastic reservoir developed a leak. He tried to order a new one to replace it himself and was told that since he wasn't a service technician, he would be charged 3 times the list price.
Variable pricing is a common practice in manufacturing behavior. And what I mean by that is, and it's better described when you talk about the list price of devices. So a manufacturer currently in this space walks in the door right now, sales rep, and says this device is $250,000. The device might cost legitimately $5,000 to make, but they're telling the customer it's $250,000. If the customer's not paying attention, the clinician or physician, the price will be $250,000. But if they start to push back, the rep will go to $180,000. And then if they push back a little more, the rep will say it's a good deal, we'll make you a luminary, whatever that means. But they somehow associate luminary or luminescence with being something good. And so maybe I'll jump on that. So now it's $140,000. Ultimately, the price can get down as low as $40,000, $50,000. We've seen manufacturers start at $250,000 and end up at $40,000 or $50,000 for the same device that really, from an OEM standpoint, costs about $5,000 to make. That's the variable pricing that exists. And why does that exist? It's because customers don't have the information to know what the market is paying on an average basis. We have that within cars and automotives and homes. We can understand what the market prices are. But in this industry, without that kind of transparency, nobody really knows. So the manufacturers prey on that by saying, you know what, no one really knows what the price is, so we'll start incredibly high and we'll work our way down until they stop. And they do the same thing on the parts. The list price is $4,000. And if you push, you'll get a better deal. And ultimately, based on the quarter or the revenue that month or what kind of pressure they're facing, they come down in price. None of this is going to change, this specific question, none of it's going to change until there's complete transparency in pricing. And that will happen. In all capital markets, and especially in our kind of medium market that exists today, that transparency will come quickly and we'll start to see flattening of prices.
It's exciting. Richard from North Carolina asked if you could discuss the orphaning of used cosmetic lasers.
Yeah, orphans. I've never heard that term, orphan, but I think that's a great way to describe it. Most laser or energy-based devices, synthetics, are not used because they're sold on an emotional basis, not a financial basis. Once they're embedded into the practice, the staff doesn't know how to use it. It's not been trained properly. It was the wrong device to begin with. The practice was already busy. It wasn't their nirvana that they thought it was going to be as far as generating revenue. The staff has a tough time adopting it. It's difficult to market. There's sales required. There's conversion, staff turnover. So most of these devices end up being really coat racks or orphans stuck in the corner and forgotten about. And literally there's hundreds of thousands of energy-based devices with literally no use on them sitting around the globe that were bought emotionally, and they become orphans. And why aren't they sold into the secondary market? It goes back to the recertification fees and the overall predatory practices that manufacturers have, and these devices are just sitting there as orphans. And so we do have an orphanage crisis of lasers in the world today, which I think like us at MRP and others are starting to repurpose these and find alternative channels and for parts and service, and we're getting them redeployed along with not just us but lots of other companies, and it's allowing clinicians to offer more services at lower prices in a safer way and maximize uptime, lower downtime. And some of these, I think we'll see a real dent in the orphans of lasers over the next decade or so.
So there's something doctors can actually do with them then. They don't just have to sit in the clinic.
No question. I think the biggest challenge is for a clinician is, they buy a laser for $100,000 or $200,000. They find out that really what the market is maybe 5 or 10% of what they paid to a reseller, and not much more to a clinician, because a clinician to a clinician sale, there's no warranty, no service. It's just a transaction, and the physician that buys it or clinician that buys it has the same barriers of getting service that they would if they bought it anywhere in the secondary market. So physicians and clinicians have a really tough time, I think, absorbing and understanding that it's not like a car when you drive it off the lot and has some depreciation. The depreciation is massive. It's 50, 60, 70, 80, 90%. It's gigantic because of these barriers. But as the markets open up and transparency opens up even further and it becomes clearer, and the markets evolve, that erosion in clinician and physician equity will recover. And we'll start to see more traditional depreciation of new assets in the next decade or so.
Well, that gives a very positive long-term spin on the issue. It's really helpful for doctors to know they have an alternative.
No question.
A part supplier of yours asked what you thought of setting up a fund for a mass mailing for doctors so that you can inform them of some of these practices in a more regular way.
I spent a lot of time and asked over the last 4 or 5 years, many times at meetings and online panels and discussions about how do we communicate this message more effectively. And it's difficult because clinicians and physicians are very busy, and they're already members of lots of associations and gets lots of information, and just one more channel in which they have to get information or go to a meeting or go to a seminar at a meeting is just difficult for them to do. And so I don't think, at least in my opinion, that you're setting up a fund or creating an association is going to be the way that clinicians get information. I think it's going to be more organic and where the information leaks out there through these types of interviews and discussions, where they get more informed and they get more empowered and they get more confident and they develop their own moxie in which they can go have these discussions with manufacturers empowered with more information. And so I think it's just going to come with more conversation and more interviews, more panel discussions, and more kind of evolution and development of the secondary market.
Perfect.